was the child of a second marriage. And Henry's second marriage, like many second marriages today, aroused very strong feelings. For instance, the imperial ambassador refused point blank to attend the baptism. He even refused to recognize Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, as Henry's wife.
Scientists finally cracked open Elizabeth I's 400-year-old secret, and what they discovered will haunt you. The Virgin Queen who ruled England with absolute power was hiding something horrific beneath her famous white makeup. For decades, she painted her face every single day, never knowing it was slowly killing her. But that's not even the worst part. When researchers analyzed her final months using modern DNA technology, they uncovered evidence so disturbing that it changed everything we thought we knew about her death.
Henry had fallen in love with another woman, Jane Seymour. For Anne, the end came with terrifying swiftness. She was accused of multiple adultery with 4 of the gentlemen of the king's chamber and of incest with her own brother.
The truth is darker than anyone imagined, and it's been hiding in plain sight this entire time. Elizabeth died in 1603 under circumstances that puzzled her contemporaries and have continued to spark debate among historians for centuries. The exact cause of her death was never officially recorded, and she specifically forbade any examination of her body after death. For over 400 years, scholars have wondered what truly ended the life of the Virgin Queen. Was it simply old age? Was it an illness? Or was there something more complex at work? Something that the people of her time couldn't fully understand or explain? Recent developments in DNA analysis and forensic science have finally provided answers to these long-standing questions. What researchers discovered goes far beyond simply explaining how she died. Their findings reveal a shocking truth about the physical price Elizabeth paid for maintaining her power, and they force us to reconsider our understanding of her entire reign. When Elizabeth ascended to the English throne in 1558, she was just 25 years old. The timing could hardly have been worse. The very concept of a woman ruling alone, without a husband to guide her decisions, was considered almost unthinkable in 16th century Europe. England had just emerged from the troubled reign of her half-sister Mary Tudor, whose time as queen had been marked by religious persecution and political instability. Mary's reign had left the country divided and weakened, and many people both inside and outside England seriously doubted whether another woman could succeed where Mary had struggled. The international situation was equally threatening. Spain, France, and the Vatican all viewed the young Protestant queen as vulnerable and potentially easy to manipulate or overthrow. Within her own kingdom, powerful nobles questioned whether she had the legitimate right to rule, and many doubted she possessed the strength necessary to hold on to power. Some openly wondered how long she would last before being forced to marry or being removed from the throne entirely. Elizabeth understood her precarious position from the very beginning. She realized quickly that her survival as queen would depend not just on smart policies and diplomatic skill, but on how she was perceived by her subjects and by foreign powers. She grasped something that many rulers throughout history have failed to understand. Image is a form of power in itself. While male rulers could rely on displays of military might or physical strength to command respect and obedience, Elizabeth had to find a different approach. She needed to create a symbol of authority so powerful that it would make her seem untouchable. The solution she developed was what historians now refer to as her mask of youth. This wasn't simply about vanity or following fashion trends. It was a calculated political strategy designed to eliminate any appearance of weakness and to convince both her subjects and her enemies that the queen existed above the level of ordinary human frailty. The most visible and striking element of this mask was her makeup. Elizabeth's face became a canvas on which she painted an image of eternal perfection. Her primary tool was a substance called Venetian ceruse, which was a mixture of white lead and vinegar. When applied to the skin, it created an extremely pale, almost luminous appearance that immediately set the wearer apart from everyone around them. In the culture of 16th century Europe, pale skin carried powerful associations. It signified nobility, wealth, and status because it indicated a life spent indoors rather than working in the sun. For the wealthy classes, paleness was proof that you didn't have to perform manual labor. For Elizabeth, however, the effect went much deeper than simple class distinction. The stark white makeup allowed her to project an image of someone untouched by the passage of time, unmarked by illness, and unaffected by the hardships that wore down ordinary people. In the eyes of those who saw her, she appeared ageless and almost supernatural. This was precisely the impression she wanted to create. Her reliance on heavy makeup became much more pronounced after a critical event in 1562. That year, Elizabeth contracted smallpox, a disease that was often fatal in that era. She survived the illness, but it left permanent scars across her face. From that point forward, she began applying increasingly thick layers of makeup to hide the damage. As the years passed, the layers grew heavier and heavier. According to reports from people who saw her in her later years, the makeup could sometimes be nearly an inch thick, giving her face the appearance of a porcelain mask rather than human skin. But the mask Elizabeth created extended well beyond cosmetics. She exercised strict control over every visual representation of herself. In an age before photography or mass media, painted portraits were the primary way most people formed an image of their monarch. Elizabeth was acutely aware of how powerful these images could be. She made certain that only portraits showing her as young, flawless, and commanding were permitted to circulate. Any painting that depicted her in an unflattering way was suppressed. In 1596, she took this control to an official level by issuing what historians call the Royal Proclamation on Portraits. This decree ordered that any unflattering or unauthorized images of the Queen be found and destroyed. Artists who wished to paint Elizabeth were required to work from approved templates. One of the most famous of these was the Darnley portrait from 1575, which showed her with perfectly smooth skin and a regal bearing. Even as Elizabeth aged and her actual appearance changed dramatically, official portraits continued to present her exactly as she had looked decades earlier. The image became frozen in time while the woman behind it continued to grow older. By combining carefully applied makeup with absolute control over her painted image, Elizabeth constructed a public persona that became inseparable from her authority as queen. The mask communicated a clear message to everyone who encountered it. This queen does not age, does not weaken, and does not bend to pressure. It was an extraordinarily powerful illusion that helped her maintain control over a nation that many had predicted would reject female rule. Yet beneath this carefully constructed facade, Elizabeth's body was paying a price that no one in her court could have fully understood. The very tools she used to project strength and immortality were slowly destroying her health in ways that wouldn't be understood until scientists examined the evidence more than 4 centuries after her death. As Elizabeth approached her 70th year, the powerful image she had maintained for decades began to crack and crumble. For most of her reign, she had been perceived as nearly invincible, a queen whose intelligence, determination, and sheer force of will set her apart from ordinary rulers. She had orchestrated the defeat of the Spanish Armada, navigated England through dangerous religious conflicts, and established her nation as an emerging power on the world stage. To the people of England, she was the Virgin Queen, a figure who seemed to exist beyond the reach of normal human frailty. But behind the closed doors of her private chambers, the reality of her final months painted a very different picture. She had become physically weak, mentally exhausted, and emotionally drained, a quiet shadow of the formidable woman she had once been. The circle of trusted advisors and companions who had supported her throughout her reign had gradually disappeared. Most of her oldest and closest allies were gone. William Cecil, the chief advisor who had guided her through countless political crises, had died in 1598. Francis Walsingham, the brilliant spy master who had managed her intelligence network and protected her from numerous assassination plots, had passed away years before that. The loss of Catherine Howard, one of her ladies-in-waiting and among her closest female companions, left her feeling increasingly isolated. In a court full of people, yet emotionally alone, more painful than any political loss, was the memory of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Elizabeth had shown him a level of affection and favor that was rare for her. She had treated him almost like a son, lavishing him with titles, lands, and opportunities. But in 1601, Essex led a reckless rebellion against her authority. The uprising failed quickly, and Elizabeth found herself in an impossible position. Despite her personal feelings, she was forced to sign his death warrant. His execution was one of the most agonizing decisions of her entire reign. Though she publicly justified it as necessary for the security of the kingdom, the act haunted her until her final days. According to Sir Robert Carey, her cousin and a member of her court, Elizabeth broke down in tears when discussing another execution that had defined her time as queen. She insisted, with what little energy she had remaining, that she had never truly given her consent to the death of Mary, Queen of Scots. Whether this claim was genuine or simply the product of guilt and regret, the words revealed how heavily the weight of past decisions pressed down on her. After decades of ruling with clarity and purpose, her regrets and grief seemed to rise up around her, overwhelming everything else. This emotional collapse triggered a complete withdrawal from public life. The queen, who had once spoken with confidence, wit, and commanding presence, now barely spoke at all. She refused even the most basic forms of personal care. She would no longer allow her attendants to help her bathe, eat properly, or get dressed. She dismissed medical treatment, pushing away her doctors and rejecting their advice. She spent most of her time sitting in complete silence, staring at nothing, disconnected from the world around her. The carefully maintained image that had been the foundation of her power collapsed along with her health. The physical decline became impossible to ignore or hide. Her teeth had decayed severely, many of them blackened and rotting. Several had fallen out completely. Painful abscesses developed in her gums and jaw, swelling with infection and causing constant agony. Every movement of her mouth, whether to speak or attempt to eat, would have triggered waves of pain. The glands in her neck became swollen and filled with pus, creating ongoing discomfort that never subsided. Years of applying lead-based white makeup and using mercury-containing medical treatments had almost certainly poisoned her blood. Her skin, which had once been covered in the stark white paste that made her appear ageless, had turned a grayish color. Sores began breaking out across her body. Her famous red hair had thinned so dramatically that she needed to wear wigs to maintain any semblance of her former appearance. Members of the court witnessed this transformation, but didn't dare mention it, fearful of triggering her anger or displeasure. In the final weeks of her life, her behavior became even more disturbing to those around her. She stopped sleeping in a bed altogether. Instead, she chose to rest on cushions scattered on the floor, or sometimes she simply stood for hours at a time, refusing to lie down. Her attendants believed she had developed a fear that if she lay down in bed, she would never rise again. She refused food, turned away water, and rejected all medicine. With each passing day, she grew visibly weaker, her body consuming itself as it received no sustenance. Just weeks before her death, she collapsed and remained almost entirely silent for 4 consecutive days. Members of the court gathered in hallways and antechambers, speaking in hushed whispers, completely uncertain about how to respond to the crisis unfolding before them. No one dared to speak her name aloud or openly acknowledge that the queen was dying. The atmosphere in the palace became tense and strange, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something they couldn't bring themselves to name. One of the most striking and disturbing signs of her deteriorating condition involved her coronation ring. She had worn this ring continuously since 1559 as a symbol of her reign and her symbolic marriage to the Kingdom of England. Now, more than 40 years later, the skin beneath the ring had swollen so severely that the gold band was cutting deep into her flesh. The ring could not be removed without causing injury. The swelling pointed to serious problems with her circulation and was clear evidence that her body's systems were failing. The Virgin Queen, who had built her entire life and reign around the principle of never showing weakness, absolutely refused to let anyone see her surrender to death. That refusal made her final days not only more physically painful, but also profoundly tragic. She was dying, and yet she would not permit herself or anyone around her to acknowledge that reality. On March 24, 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old. Her death marked the end of an era that had transformed England. She had ruled for 45 years, steering her kingdom through wars, political turmoil, and religious division. Yet despite the magnitude of what her death meant, she passed away quietly, without ceremony or fanfare. No official cause of death was ever recorded. She had given strict orders forbidding any examination of her body after death. This decision represented her final attempt to protect the carefully crafted image she had spent her lifetime building and maintaining. The news of her passing sent shockwaves throughout the kingdom. Although she had grown increasingly frail in recent months, few people had truly expected her death. Many had lived their entire lives knowing no other monarch. In her final hours, she had been unable to speak. She left behind no last words, no public farewell, no final message to her people. The silence surrounding her death felt deeply unsettling to those who had served her. It seemed as though the woman who had spoken with such authority and command throughout her reign had chosen to exit the world without offering any explanation. Her body was transported to Westminster Abbey, where she was laid to rest in a grand tomb befitting her status. With Elizabeth's death, the Tudor dynasty came to a definitive end. For decades, she had ruled without marrying and without officially naming an heir, leaving constant questions about who would eventually inherit the crown. But now, with her death, the transition was already in motion. James VI of Scotland would become James I of England, uniting the crowns of both countries and beginning a new chapter in royal history. On paper, the transition of power proceeded smoothly, yet the public mourned deeply and genuinely. Their queen, the only ruler that many of them had ever known, was gone forever. The silence Elizabeth had left behind created a vacuum, a space where stories, doubts, and conspiracy theories could take root and grow. In the months and years that followed her death, those myths would only become stronger and more elaborate. One of the most shocking and disturbing accounts of Elizabeth's death came from Elizabeth Southwell, one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting who had been present during those final days. Southwell claimed that after Elizabeth was buried, her body burst open inside the coffin and released foul-smelling vapors. At the time, many people dismissed this account as nothing more than propaganda spread by Jesuits who were deeply opposed to Elizabeth's Protestant rule and wanted to damage her reputation even in death. For centuries, historians treated the story as an unfounded rumor, the kind of sensational tale that often circulates after the death of a controversial figure. However, modern science has revealed that Southwell's description may actually have been based on something real rather than pure invention. When a body has been weakened by poisoning, disease, or malnutrition, it can decompose more rapidly than a healthy body would under normal circumstances. When such a body is sealed inside a coffin with no way for gases to escape, the natural process of decomposition creates pressure that builds up over time. In rare but documented cases, this pressure can become so intense that it causes the coffin to rupture or burst open. Scientists now refer to this phenomenon as exploding casket syndrome. While the term sounds dramatic, it describes a genuine occurrence that has been documented in forensic literature. What Southwell described, though horrifying to witness, may well have been a real event caused by the specific conditions of Elizabeth's body at the time of her death. There were also persistent claims that Elizabeth had essentially given up on living during her final weeks. Multiple attendants reported that she refused all food and medicine, and that she even refused to sleep in her bed. instead choosing to remain seated on cushions for days on end without moving. Some observers believe she had deliberately willed herself to die, overwhelmed by grief, regret, and complete exhaustion. In the religious and cultural context of her time, such an act was viewed as deeply troubling and even sinful. The idea that a monarch would choose death over continuing to rule was almost incomprehensible to most people. Others whispered about something even darker. Rumors spread throughout Catholic Europe that Elizabeth had been poisoned by members of her own court, perhaps as part of a scheme to clear the way for James VI of Scotland to inherit the English throne without complications or delay. Poison was a constant source of fear and paranoia in Tudor politics. High-profile poisoning cases had occurred before, and the unusual nature of Elizabeth's symptoms made the story seem believable to many who heard it. The fact that she had forbidden any examination of her body only added fuel to these suspicions. What made the entire mystery so difficult to solve was the complete absence of solid medical evidence. The medical knowledge available in the early 17th century was extremely limited compared to what we understand today. Doctors of that era did not have access to blood tests, imaging scans, microscopes, or any of the diagnostic tools that modern medicine relies on. Their understanding of how diseases worked, how toxins affected the body, and even basic human anatomy was rudimentary at best. They worked largely from theory and observation, often drawing incorrect conclusions from what they saw. For 400 years, people could only speculate and guess about what had really happened to Elizabeth. But in the 21st century, advances in forensic science and medical analysis finally made it possible to revisit this historical mystery with tools that would have seemed like magic to Elizabeth's own doctors. In a remarkable episode of Sky History's Royal Autopsy series, a team of leading medical and scientific experts decided to apply modern forensic techniques to one of the greatest unsolved medical mysteries of the Tudor era: what actually killed Queen Elizabeth I. The investigation was led by Dr. Brett Lockyer, a Home Office pathologist with extensive experience in analyzing causes of death, and Professor Alice Roberts, an acclaimed biological anthropologist known for her work in reconstructing historical medical conditions. Together with their research team, they embarked on an examination of Elizabeth's final months using every tool that modern science could offer. They drew on original historical documents written by people who had witnessed Elizabeth's decline firsthand. They created detailed medical reconstructions based on the symptoms that had been recorded. They used cutting-edge DNA modeling techniques to build a comprehensive profile of what the Queen's health would have looked like during that final period of her life. Their goal was ambitious. They weren't simply trying to identify what killed her. They wanted to understand what her body must have endured during those final months, what she experienced physically, and how various factors may have contributed to her death. What the team discovered through their investigation was both deeply human and surprisingly tragic. It revealed suffering that had gone unrecognized for centuries. Dr. Lockyer focused his attention on the Queen's deteriorating dental health. Historical portraits of Elizabeth and personal records kept by members of her court had hinted at serious problems with her teeth and gums. Through forensic modeling and analysis of the historical descriptions, Lockyer uncovered evidence of severe tooth decay, advanced gum disease, and a large abscess that had formed on her jaw. This combination of dental problems would have caused her constant, unrelenting pain that only grew worse over time. Every movement of her mouth, every attempt to speak to her attendants or eat even small amounts of food would have triggered intense agony. Lockyer explained that this type of oral infection, left untreated in an era before antibiotics or modern dental surgery, would only spread and worsen. The infection could easily have spread from her mouth to other parts of her body, creating additional complications and contributing to her overall decline. Professor Roberts then turned her expertise to examining Elizabeth's cosmetics, particularly focusing on the thick white paste known as Venetian ceruse that had become the Queen's signature look. Laboratory tests confirmed what historians had long suspected. This substance was made primarily from white lead, one of the most dangerous and toxic metals known to affect human health. Elizabeth had applied this lead-based makeup to her skin almost every single day for decades, starting from her 20s and continuing into her late 60s. Instead of protecting her image and helping her maintain power, the makeup was silently destroying her health from within. Roberts explained that chronic exposure to lead over such an extended period could account for many of the most disturbing symptoms Elizabeth experienced in her later life. Her thinning hair, which had once been thick and red, but had deteriorated so badly she needed wigs, was consistent with lead poisoning. Her constant fatigue and weakness matched the pattern. Her fragile teeth and bleeding gums fit the profile. The swollen glands in her neck, the recurring infections that plagued her body, and even the sores that broke out across her skin, all aligned with what medical science knows about long-term lead exposure. Even her reported bouts of confusion, mood swings, and emotional instability matched the neurological effects that lead poisoning can cause. Elizabeth had built her entire power structure on an image of physical perfection and eternal youth. But behind that carefully maintained mask, her body was literally breaking down cell by cell, poisoned by the very substance she believed was preserving her appearance. Yet even with the unbearable dental pain and the devastating hidden effects of decades of lead poisoning, the medical team realized that something was still missing from the picture. They knew there had to be additional factors at play. They examined the Queen's final recorded symptoms in greater detail, paying particular attention to reports from the last days and weeks of her life. Among the most concerning signs were her severely swollen hands and feet, along with serious respiratory distress. Multiple eyewitness accounts described how she struggled to breathe properly and appeared extremely fatigued, even when she hadn't exerted herself physically. It was only when the experts began connecting all these symptoms together, looking at the complete picture rather than isolated problems, that a clearer and more complete medical explanation began to emerge. The swelling, the breathing difficulties, the extreme fatigue, and the body's inability to fight off infection all pointed toward a specific conclusion. What they uncovered next completely transformed the understanding of how Elizabeth died and revealed the final piece of a puzzle that had remained unsolved for more than 4 centuries. After conducting a thorough investigation into every recorded symptom and carefully analyzing the timeline leading up to Queen Elizabeth I's death, Dr. Lockyer and his team reached a conclusion that was both surprising and definitive. Bronchopneumonia, a serious lung infection, was the direct cause of death. This infection caused fluid to accumulate in her lungs, which progressively made it harder and harder for her to breathe. As the infection spread and worsened, it developed into sepsis, a life-threatening condition where bacteria enter the bloodstream and trigger a massive inflammatory response throughout the entire body. Elizabeth's body, already severely weakened by age, malnutrition, lead poisoning, and chronic infections, was simply too compromised to mount an effective defense. Her heart, exhausted from years of strain and unable to cope with the systemic infection, finally gave out. Dr. Lockyer explained the progression clearly. The infection that began in her lungs eventually spread into her bloodstream, causing what is known as blood poisoning or septicemia. Her heart, already failing, could not sustain her life under these conditions. That was ultimately why she died. For centuries, people had speculated wildly about the cause of Elizabeth's death, creating elaborate theories involving poison, murder, or mysterious curses. These rumors and legends had given her death an air of dark mystery and intrigue. So when the final scientific answer pointed to something as medically straightforward as pneumonia, a relatively common illness, it almost seemed anticlimactic or disappointing to some. But as the researchers examined their findings more carefully and considered the full context of what they had learned, they realized that what they had uncovered was actually far more disturbing than any dramatic poisoning plot would have been. Elizabeth I didn't simply rule England for 45 years. She transformed herself into something far more powerful than a monarch. She became a legend, a symbol, and an idea that has survived more than 4 centuries beyond her death. Even today, her name continues to spark debate, fascination, and endless study among historians, writers, filmmakers, and political analysts. People remain drawn to her story not just because of the decisions she made or the battles she won, but because of who she managed to become in the eyes of her contemporaries and in the memory of history. Her reign is often described as the Elizabethan Golden Age, a period when English culture flourished in ways that still shape how we think about that era. Under her rule, William Shakespeare wrote and staged the plays that would become cornerstones of English literature. English ships began exploring and dominating trade routes across the world's oceans. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 represented a turning point that shifted the balance of naval and political power in Europe. But these achievements, impressive as they were, only scratch the surface of why Elizabeth continues to hold such a powerful grip on our collective imagination. Elizabeth understood something that many rulers throughout history have failed to grasp. Nations and empires run on narratives and perceptions just as much as they run on military strength or economic resources. She controlled not just government policy and military strategy, but also how she was perceived by both her subjects and her enemies. This understanding shaped every decision she made about her public image. Religion represented perhaps the most dangerous threat to her rule when she first came to power. England had been torn apart by violent swings between Catholic and Protestant rule under her father Henry VIII and her half-siblings Edward and Mary. Elizabeth recognized that another radical religious shift could plunge the country into civil war. She chose a middle path, establishing Protestantism as the official state religion, while showing just enough tolerance toward Catholics to prevent widespread revolt. This careful balancing act, which required constant attention and adjustment, allowed her to maintain a level of unity that many observers had thought impossible. Political scholars have studied her religious policy for centuries, fascinated by how she turned what could have been a fatal compromise into a source of strength. Elizabeth also reshaped culture and controlled information in ways that extended far beyond simple pageantry or ceremony. She used censorship and maintained tight control over the printing press to carefully manage her public image. Nothing critical of the Queen was permitted to be printed or circulated. Plays and pamphlets required official approval before they could be performed in theaters or sold in the streets. The result was a society where her image became impossible to separate from English national identity itself. She wasn't just the person who happened to be ruling the country. She became England personified, the living embodiment of the nation and its values. Her deliberate refusal to name a successor until the very end of her life added another layer to her mystique and power. For decades, nobles at her court, foreign ambassadors, and even her closest advisors worried constantly about who would rule after her death. Marriage proposals came from across Europe, each one carrying political implications. Potential heirs jockeyed for position and favor. By keeping the question unanswered year after year, Elizabeth made herself absolutely indispensable. As long as she lived, she remained the only certainty in English politics. Nobody could plan for the future without accounting for her continued presence. That deliberate ambiguity became an integral part of her legend, reinforcing her reputation as a ruler who could outmaneuver even her most determined rivals and critics. At the same time, the personal cost of her choices makes her story as tragic as it is triumphant. Remaining unmarried helped her retain complete power and avoid being controlled by a husband, but it left her increasingly isolated as she aged. Refusing to share authority with advisors or potential successors meant she carried the enormous burden of ruling entirely alone, with no one to truly confide in or rely upon. Her strict censorship protected her public reputation, but it also forced her to live inside a carefully constructed image that permitted no mistakes, no vulnerability, and no authentic human connection. Even her refusal to name an heir, while politically strategic, left the entire kingdom in a state of permanent uncertainty, with everyone forced to accept her as the sole figure holding the country together. This combination of brilliance and sacrifice, of strategic calculation and personal cost, explains why Elizabeth continues to fascinate us. She was not simply a successful ruler of her particular historical moment. She consciously crafted herself into a myth designed to outlast her physical body. And that myth has proven remarkably durable. The recent medical investigation into her death adds a new dimension to how we understand her story. The revelation that she died from pneumonia after years of suffering from lead poisoning, dental infections, and malnutrition doesn't diminish her achievements. Instead, it makes them more remarkable. She maintained absolute control over a nation and projected an image of divine perfection while her body was slowly deteriorating and causing her constant pain. The mask she wore wasn't just makeup and carefully staged portraits. It was a performance she maintained every single day, even as the cost to her physical and mental health became devastating. The fascination with Elizabeth's life and death isn't really about celebrating her victories or mourning her suffering. It's about recognizing the extraordinary price she paid to achieve immortality in history's memory. She sacrificed personal happiness, physical health, and human connection to become something more than human in the eyes of her people. Whether that trade was worth it remains an open question, one that each person who studies her story must answer for themselves. What remains undeniable is that she succeeded in her goal. More than 400 years after her death, we're still talking about her, still trying to understand her, and still grappling with the legend she so carefully constructed.